Okay, we were going through some rather interesting material in the last class, at least I thought it was, dealing with the objections to the proofs for God's existence or objections to God's existence, and we had gone through, by my count, about 13 of them. So we will start from that point unless anybody's got some favorite one that they run across in the last week that you wish to bring up. The objection that I have is number 14, is one pertaining to the fifth way. And the objection is in terms of the hypothesis of multi-universes. That, first of all, usually the response that's being given is to the anthropic principle, which has been put forward by a number of scientists who argue that things in this universe are just so that the universe appears to be actually designed for life, and ultimately even intelligent life, if you want to carry it out to its what seems to be its logical conclusion. So the atheist response is to say, no, hold on a minute, that doesn't necessarily follow, because it's possible that we have a virtual unlimited number of coexisting universes, and that this cosmos, as we know it, is only one of them, and therefore, out of an almost infinite number of possibilities, surely one of these universes would be just like this one is. And it appears to be designed for intelligence because, of course, being a universe in which intelligent beings exist, naturally they look back at the universe and say, hey, this was designed for us. But in fact, it's just pure randomness that happens that this one universe happens to be this way. Or there might even be a number of them like this, but the number of possible universes is so great that it still would be just a matter of blind chance. Now,
sorry,
sure.
That's the theist's evolution?
No, this is the atheists.
The atheists, oh,
Yeah.
okay. Just blind chance.
Or they would not necessarily an atheist, but somebody who might look at the argument from design, the claim that it's looks like it's been intelligently designed, and say, no, you can't prove that because there's a possibility that there was an almost infinite number of universes, and this just happens to be one. Actually, I will touch on this a couple other points, so I'll come back to it later. But one of the things that is a difficulty, even with respect to that, is that you do not escape completely the concept of order, because the very physical mechanism by which they claim multiple universes would be formed itself conforms to a general law of physics. In other words, if you're going to have a system that begets multiple universes, that system itself is systematized. It is itself an order. And I suppose one might also point out that although it seems to undermine the anthropic principle, one could simply say, well, God's just got a very rich way of creating things. And he just happened to do this whole amazing, unlimited multiplicity of universes so that in one or more of them he could have planted the conditions necessary for life and intelligent life. You're going to find on a lot of these that there's more than one way to look at the issue. So I'm not trying to nail any specific way down. Please remember, what are we speculating about? This is natural science. If you have had the course in metaphysics, you realize you don't prove God by natural science, and you don't disprove God by natural science. The intellectual move to the existence of a transcendent supernatural being necessarily is a move beyond physics. It's a move beyond cosmology to metaphysics or ontology. So, and that's one of the objections to the ID theorists trying to somehow prove God's existence, that what they wind up doing is metaphysics. But let's be fair to the ID theorists, because many of them would say that they're not trying to prove the existence of God, but merely that the world as we find it bespeaks the operation of some intelligent agent or agents, and they stop there. And they would say this is no less scientific than forensic medicine. If you find a body laying on the ground, did this person die by chance or were they murdered? The whole point of forensic evidence and forensic inference is to look at the deceased and from it infer that they were rendered deceased by an intelligent agent. They would say that's all we're doing. No more. Don't pin any more on us. Number 15. Another objection, and I'm just giving you things you find on the internet. I'm not vouching for them by any means. One objection is scientific creationism is a faulty science, bad science, lousy science. Okay, the answer to that is, so what? You don't prove God by natural science. If some scientific creationists think they can do it, and if their science is faulty, again, so what? What does this prove? Obviously, there's a lot of people who are not scientific creationists who also maintain that legitimate science is not opposed to a demonstration of God's existence. So it doesn't. If you happen to hold scientific creationism, of course, then you would say that this objection is simply wrong and that the science is valid. But again, either way you go, it doesn't demonstrate that God does not exist. Number 16, one of the objections you get, this is a little different, is one can be moral without God. All right, that's nice. Again, a lot of ways you can respond to that. One is, okay, so we don't prove God by morality. There's other ways to do it. You don't rely on that. Another point is simply to observe that it isn't true. In fact, you can't get morality without God, because ultimately, if there is no one above us to whom we are responsible, we become God. We become our own moral lawgiver. And in which case, if we are our own lawgiver, we are perfectly free to change the rules. So sometimes they'll argue, well, if you don't live according to some kind of a natural moral code, it's self-destructive or it will lead to early death or something. Well, okay, but so what? Again, why not? If there's no ultimate lawgiver, why should I not be self-destructive? Why should I not commit suicide? I don't owe my life to anybody. So I think that the claim that you can have morality without God is not sufficiently examined. It is not what we understand by ethics as meaning that there are universal, absolute principles that must always be observed and can never be violated. The problem is, if there is no God, where do you get the principles from? Why shouldn't you violate them? Because really, they're simply the principles you have chosen to accept. You're perfectly free to change them because you're God.
Eric Holder will enforce me.
Number 17, this is the old problem of many of the atheists you see on the internet will say, God's impossible. It's a self-contradictory concept. And they'll pick something like, omniscience. God's supposed to know everything, and they'll say that this prevents free will. Why? Because God knows what we're going to do before we do it. So if we are actually free, then God can't exist. Well, a part of this arises from never having had a good course in metaphysics. They don't seem to realize, first of all, that all these allegedly contradictory qualities that one claims to find in God, in fact, upon close inspection, are simply not contradictory. And God, knowing what we're going to do before we do it, is making the classical mistake of putting God into time. God is in eternity. So he simply sees us, both as to our beginning, our middle, and our end, and he sees free acts as free. And he sees naturally necessitated acts as necessary. Again, so what? Most of the objections I've seen on the internet are objections, as I say, that I would expect from incoming freshmen. And then, of course, you've got the one, number 18, that points out the Bible says, "Thou shalt not kill." You all know the answer to that one. It doesn't. And then they object that the Bible afterwards sanctions killing. Well, they're quite right, because it doesn't mean "thou shalt not kill." It means "thou shalt not do murder." And some instances of killing are not murder. They may be self-defense, or you may be executing someone who's guilty as sin. But you see, when you look at the objections to God on the internet, some of them are metaphysical, some of them are scientific, some of them are attacking the Bible. They take all different kinds of forms. Number 19, let's go back to something more scientific. This one's an interesting one because it pertains to the question of how could the universe have come in the first place? It seems like from nothing you don't get something. If you accept the Big Bang, now of course even that's controverted. If you accept the Big Bang, it's argued that the cosmos must have had a beginning, and since you can't get something from nothing, then it would have required infinite power to produce the cosmos, therefore God must exist. Of course, there are two ways they try to answer this. One is to say the universe didn't have a beginning. What we call the beginning of the cosmos, the Big Bang, is simply some kind of a quantum fluctuation. And one of their scientists makes this claim: quantum events can happen without a cause. Quantum events can happen without a cause. Of course, again, it helps to have had a course in metaphysics. You don't have anything happening without a cause. What they really mean by that, and accepting their own quantum mechanics, they mean that very, very little quantum energy is required. Well, if that's true, you still are starting with something. What they are arguing is, another argument there is that it doesn't really have a beginning. What happens is the cosmos is, as it were, a bubble that has formed within the fabric of an eternal universe that is even greater than the present one. I've seen one scientist arguing that even those people have it wrong, because even if you have bubbles forming out of prior universes, the whole thing presupposes a starting point for reasons that he demonstrates, that you cannot go back to infinity. You may, in time, you may have a lot of universes generating more universes. That might be possible according to their physical theory. But even according to that theory, if you run back the rate of inflation by which the universe suddenly has popped into existence, because according to the latest theory, you have what's called a rapid inflation from the Big Bang, very rapid, within milliseconds, to a very huge cosmos. But if you back this up time-wise, you find going back through time that because of relativity theory, you reach a point at which you come to a starting point that you cannot go beyond. So even according to that theory, there has to be a starting point. Again, please remember, this is all physics. This is not metaphysics. This is not even philosophy. But these are the kinds of arguments that are picked up by many of the people that are debating these things on the internet today. And this acceptance of general physical theory has come to replace what used to be classical philosophical arguments in many instances. Another argument, number 20, they attack Dr. Michael Behe's irreducible complexity argument, because after all, assuming that that's designed to prove God's existence, now Dr. Behe's the first one to tell you that that's not what he's trying to do. He's only trying to show that there's intelligence present, that it takes an intellectual activity to produce the complexity that's found. Their objection to his arguments runs along the line that what looks like irreducible complexity turns out really to be reducible, because by evolutionary mechanisms you produce one particular genetic modification which may not function in the final product, but which is a step, a staircase to that final product. Now, Dr. Behe does not accept that argument, and among other things points out that there are so many instances of irreducible complexity in the biological world that even if you could manage to explain a few of them this way, sheer probability would demonstrate that you could never explain all of them. But again, the objection, the argument, is that what Dr. Behe's saying, or the other ID theorists, is simply not good science. They attack the science. But as I mentioned before, Dr. Behe and others are well aware that their arguments are from extrinsic finality, such as William Paley's arguments were, like the divine watchmaker, that something had to put things together so they all work together for the common good. St. Thomas does have an argument like that, and I'm not saying it can't be sustained, but the fifth way of St. Thomas, the Quinta Via, is an argument from intrinsic finality, not extrinsic finality. It's from the fact that all the parts of a given organism operate for the good of the whole, and not that all of the various organisms interact so as to produce some kind of common order in the biological world. So it's a different kind of argument. It's an argument for finality from within, and that's the argument from governance, which is found in the fifth way. Number 21, faith is simply belief without evidence. Science is based upon evidence and can be demonstrated because it produces successful research. In other words, basically, we can do stuff with science. You can't do it with faith. And faith is simply belief without evidence. Well, first of all, this arises, unfortunately, from a lot of fideism. It arises from a lot of Christians who argue that everything is based only upon biblical revelation, and there's no other way to know anything. So that you've got the divine word of God in the Bible against what the scientists claim. If those were the only two alternatives, then the argument might make some sense. But to say that faith is without any evidence is to ignore the rational foundations for faith. The preambula fidei, which the Catholic Church has always defended, that there are certain presuppositions of the act of faith which can be known by natural reason, among them the existence of God, the ability of the mind to know the world around us, the veracity of God, because what good does it do to have a Bible telling you all kinds of stories if God's a big liar? You got to know that what he would reveal is truthful and must be truthful. So when you talk about evidence, what the positivist, well, the empiricist is talking about, he's talking about laboratory evidence. He's talking about experimental evidence. He's not talking about merely rational evidence. Because rational evidence, as we do in the proofs for God's existence, we start with things that are common experience, such as motion. Things are in motion. That's not, there's no scientist that proves things are in motion. He takes that as his starting point, too. And remember good old Descartes, you ask him, well, what's motion? What's the definition of motion? He says, waving his arm, this is motion. Okay, that's fine. It's like saying, what is a dog? And Lassie walks in, you say, that's a dog. But that's not a definition of dogginess. And moving your arm is not a definition of motion. That's why Aristotle defines motion as the act of a being in potency insofar as it's in potency. It's a very definite, precise, logically defined explanation of what motion means in an intelligible sense, which most physicists wouldn't have a clue about. So, yes, faith per se, it's a belief in things that God has revealed, but it is not irrational, and the proofs for God's existence are not based simply on faith, but upon natural reason. They can be known by the light of unaided reason, as Vatican I says. And not everything that we know with certitude has to be used to send a rocket to the moon. In other words, and as a matter of fact, remember, natural science itself uses the same kind of reasoning we do proving God's existence. What do we do proving God's existence? We start with observable effects, and from them reason back to a first cause. What do natural scientists do? They start with observable phenomena, and from them hypothesize explanations that are possible as the cause of them, and then run experiments to try to verify those explanations. But even they are assuming that for all these phenomena there are causes. And don't forget that their notion of causality is not the same as the philosopher's notion of causality, at least not the Thomist. For a Thomistic philosophy, the cause is simultaneous with the effect. The modern-day physicist has his notion of cause from David Hume, that one observable phenomena occurring, from that you can predict another observable phenomena. Every time you light a fire, you will get smoke. And of course, maybe you'll get a smokeless fire and it undoes your causality. We all know, unless you have a crystal ball, that you can't always predict what's going to happen in this physical world when you observe a certain phenomenon, because something could interfere with what would be expected even according to natural physical law. But the proofs for God's existence just don't work that way. They start with the effect and reason back to an adequate, sufficient cause. Number 22. This pertains to the same thing I gave you in 19, but I just have a few other thoughts on it. They sometimes actually give the argument, and I put this in quotation marks, that there's such a thing as spontaneous creation. Spontaneous creation is the reason there's something rather than nothing. Even Stephen Hawking raises the question, why is there something rather than nothing, and then does handstands to try to get rid of God. In fact, that citation I just gave you, it's from Hawking. It's from his book, The Grand Design. Spontaneous creation is the reason there's something rather than nothing. But of course, when you ask him, what do you mean by spontaneous creation? That goes back to the notion that you can have quantum events without a cause, which turns out not to be quite without a cause, but quantum levels of energy. They're always working with something. You're always working with a quantum field. You're working with the quantum mechanics principles, laws, explanation. However bizarre they may seem to be, they're not working with absolutely nothing, and they want to give you the impression that they are. They'll say you've got absolutely nothing because you've got a positron and something that completely contradicts it at the same time. And then they just neutralize each other. So they go poof, they disappear. They're non-being. But you're working within a quantum field. You're always working within a real structure of some kind of entity. Whatever you want to call it, it's not absolutely nothing. Again, this whole notion that there are multiverses, that's an interesting idea itself, that arises from string theory. And as of right now, we can't demonstrate string theory. As a matter of fact, one pretty good physicist points out that when you're talking about the Big Bang, going back to the very, very beginning point, I think they call it a Yakta moment or something, Yakta center, they have to keep making up new words. But it's when almost nothing has happened, but you've got this rapid inflation at that very point where you're trying to figure out what could have caused it, all your evidence just disappears. It looks like there's no way to get any deeper into it. As Robert Jastrow said some years back, he said, the Big Bang burned up all the evidence of its occurrence. You know? It's like trying to figure out what happened when somebody's burned all the evidence. And we can go back closer and closer to that starting point, but unfortunately, that point beyond which we can't penetrate, it's back further that you would be able to find the evidence to tell you whether you have multiverses, multiple universes, which makes it appear, at least in terms of anything we know now or can speculate, that you'll never be able to demonstrate multiple universes. You may not be able to demonstrate they don't exist, but you can't demonstrate they do exist. It just makes good science fiction for Star Trek.
And an alternative.
As an alternative, it's an alternative to God. Susan?
Could you just sum up in one sentence, what is string theory?
No.
Takes more than one sentence.
Yeah. It's the idea, if I understand it at all, and I don't, it's outside my field, but it means that when you go down looking for the most basic particles, ultimately, the idea is that instead of just having one or two or three forms of space, you know, like the 3 dimensions plus time, that there are 11 dimensions, and that they arise because the ultimate particle is like a string that can have, as you understand music, you can have various harmonics on it. And depending upon how it's vibrating, you get different levels of particle formation. So, and so that you have one ultimate string, which is the foundation for all of the various forms that the ultimate units of matter can take. The problem is it's a beautiful mathematical theory. And the argument has often been the case, and this is what modern day physics goes into. It turns into mathematics. And the demonstration of the reality of it is the mathematics are elegant. This is not the notion that people have in the street that it's somehow empirically verifiable by an experiment that you can work. On quite the contrary, these are a couple guys standing up at a chalkboard with a piece of chalk writing out these brilliant mathematical formulae which are perfectly fitting to their hypothesis. But that's infinitely distant than the idea of something you can demonstrate in the physical world. And that's the difficulty with multiple universes. They're hoping, they're trying to think that maybe they'll find a little bulge or something in the entire cosmology which will indicate there's another bubble intruding on us. But at the present moment, this is purely speculation. And as I say, some reputable physicists say that's all it's ever going to be. Fortunately, from the standpoint of metaphysics, we don't care. If you've got a umpteen quadrillion universes, we don't prove the existence of God that way. That's all got tied up with the notion that you go back to a beginning in time, which, as you know, the church has always insisted is a matter of faith. St. Thomas insists it's not a matter of reason that the world had a beginning in time. It's a matter of faith. But somehow all of the contemporary arguments have gotten centered around the idea that you've got to be able to prove a beginning in time, and if you can't prove it, then the universe was eternal and you don't need God. Nonsense. The proofs for God's existence not only don't depend on there being a first point in time, some of them depend on the hypothesis that there wasn't one, such as the tertia via, the third way, from possibility and necessity. St. Thomas's argument arises from the hypothesis that the universe is eternal. He's not saying it is, but he's perfectly willing to entertain it as a logical possibility. Everybody knows if the universe really had a beginning in time, no fudging, no other universes, no eternal cosmos, if it really had a beginning in time, they know they're up against a hard place as atheists. And that's why people like Stephen Hawking do handsprings to avoid the possibility that the Big Bang is really the Big Bang, really the beginning. 13.7.
He does those handsprings in his wheelchair.
Yes, 13.7 billion years ago. So in a way, it's very interesting to see this intense debate taking place, utterly missing the point, utterly missing the whole foundation for the proofs of God's existence. Partially, David Hume and Immanuel Kant are to blame because they moved away from the traditional metaphysical arguments, and Hume replaced the notion of causality with a new conception which doesn't really get you any place. And that's why you see them all arguing about going back and back and back in time, trying to find a first cause and saying if the universe absolutely had a beginning, then there might have to be a God back there. And of course, we don't do it that way. The proofs all prescind from going back in time. They take a phenomena to be explained here and now in the present, and you are explaining it by a chain of causes that operate here and now simultaneously, leading to a first cause, you might say, in the vertical order, not the horizontal order going backward through time. Does anybody else have any other arguments that they may have found something you found rather interesting? I mean, I've given you about 20 of them here. That's all I've been able to find that look kind of different. But what's interesting about them is that they all, or most of them, share a rather naive understanding of metaphysics, a naive understanding of the proofs for God's existence. They're wrapped up in a almost blind acceptance of natural science as the only way of knowing anything. And it's quite understandable because we live in a world that's dominated by positivism and materialism, and to tell people that philosophers might have something to say that is not based on natural science directly, they're just not prepared to accept that. And yet, ironically, if you know the classical proofs for God's existence, in order to deny the existence of God, and I've told you this before, basically you have to deny the basic truths that are evident or assumed by you when you play a game of pool. If you've ever played a game of pool in your life, billiards, and you accept the requirements for playing the game, you have accepted all that you need to know to demonstrate God's existence. The basic principles that are being ignored or denied. First of all, that you can see the pool table, that there's really a pool table there. Goodbye, Mr. Kant. When we talk about phenomena, the natural scientists, that word phenomena, we got it from Kant. We got it meaning his argument that we don't know things in themselves, the noumena, we only know the phenomena, the way they appear to us. So that his universal laws turn out to be laws of the phenomena, which means subjective experience. And that's why he rejects the cosmological and teleological arguments, because he says the laws they're based on are just restricted to human subjective experience. There's no way to use them transcendentally to know that there exists some kind of a transcendent God to this world. You don't even know the world. He saves all of physical law, but they're only the laws of his own brain. But aside from that, where was I going?
You see the whole table.
Yeah. Phenomena. Nobody could seriously take that as the stopping point for very long. Go ask any natural scientist you see today, what do you mean by phenomena? When you say celestial phenomena, are you talking about seeing points of lights inside your cranium? Of course not. You're talking about really existing events light years away from this planet that we observe in the night sky. Maybe they took place light years ago, but they're really existing outside phenomena. In fact, the whole of natural science is based on observing the natural world as really existing extramental realities. Well, what happened to phenomena? Go back to Kant around 1800. Here we are in 2014. That word phenomena, see what happened to it? It shifted. Nobody could keep it where Kant had it. It came more and more to be understood. I mean, through Auguste Comte and the positivists, they talked about phenomena, and very quickly by phenomena people understood things taking place in the real world. So contemporary science, even those who say all you really know are images in your brain, remember they got the problem that they know about the brain because they observed external phenomena. And their whole science, everything they tell you about in the books, psychology, physiology, biology, even the things they use to argue that all you know are things happening in your brain, all those books depict a world outside that was observed by experimenters and scientists describing the real physical world. So nobody gets away from believing in the real physical world today. And that's your pool table. And according to that, we know the real world, and forget about your subjectivism and idealism. Secondly, in other words, epistemological realism is the starting point. And that's what you need to prove God's existence. So if you accept that you can play the pool on a table, you're already an epistemological realist. You got one of the major starting points. But I would argue if you're a decent scientist, you're an epistemological realist too. You can't not be. I mean, if you really weren't, you should be laughed out of the scientific community. Secondly, non-contradiction. I mean, you're seeing those pool balls there. Are they there or aren't they there? You can't say, well, the 8-ball is sort of there, but it's not there. Come on. Causality. One ball hits another ball. And it moves it. And you see one hit the one and move the other. There's your causality. The one that's being driven is the effect. The one that drives it is the cause. And it occurs at the same time. You can see one moving another right across the table. This is directly observable. Finality. Well, there's no finality. How on earth are you going to put the number 6 ball in the corner pocket? You can't aim it. We know it. And when you hit it, does it have a tendency to go where it's going? Like somebody said something about if you wanted to be a perfect shot, what you do is you shoot, and then whatever you hit, you call the target. Principle of sufficient reason. You can't play pool without knowing that there's reasons for why you're winning or losing. And then finally, that motion requires a mover. You may not understand all of these fully and perfectly, and obviously this is a common sense experience. But what has to be denied by the atheists in order to get rid of the proofs for God's existence is the things that most everybody knows when they play a game of pool. And this is important because you many times have professors dogmatically telling the public that you can't prove God's existence, but if they had to tell the public what they're assuming in order to get that conclusion, the public would reject them wholesale. See, if you try to tell somebody you don't even know what's going on a pool table, most people would not too readily accept that. And I'm not saying we can't critically and in a scholarly way refute what they're saying, but I'm just saying that what is required to actually prove God's existence are not things that are so esoteric, and they're not things that are so readily dismissed by contemporary science. Okay, those are the main points that I could find in terms of objections to proving God's existence. Unless you have something else that you've thought of, I'll go back to the 24 Theses. And what I'm going to do, we're in number 22. I'll go through 23, 24. We finished those, but then I'm going to go back and make some commentary on why the Thomistic philosophical system is superior to any other. And indeed, I would say not merely superior, but irreplaceable compared to any other. But I want to finish up the 24 Theses before we do that. Going back to number 22, I think we already dealt with the ontological argument. In fact, I think we did it twice. And we've looked at some of the objections. Now, I'm not going to go through each of these proofs, but just to quickly understand the nature of them and how they differ from some of the objections we've been looking at. He lists what are basically the 5 ways. And starting with the prima via, the first way, we start, as he says, these arguments are a priori. We start with the things that have been created. We argue from effects to cause, starting, namely, with things which are moved and cannot be the adequate source of their own motion. And that, of course, you need the principle that anything that's in motion cannot move itself, but is being moved by something other. Whatever is in motion is here and now being moved by something else. Notice that doesn't go back in time. That's simultaneous motion. If something's in motion, it is being moved here and now. There's a lot one can say about that. That's a lecture in itself I'm not going to get into. But take it for granted, and if you look back in the Metaphysics course, or when I did the proofs for God's existence, which would be on another set of CDs, I elaborated on this, but the movers and things moved act at the same time. You cannot go to infinite regress in the taking of movers and things moved. Now again, this is not a matter of going back in time. These are simultaneous movers and things moved. And that again is what's missed by contemporary positivists, reductionists, materialists. They all tend to think of motion going back through time. St. Thomas is not talking about that. And because it's simultaneous, you have to come to a first mover unmoved.
I was going to say, I've even seen the first way described as dominoes.
That's the standard one in Enoch Stumpf's survey of philosophy, which was the book that we used when I was teaching. The entire department had to use this book. And the example of dominoes was given there, which is categorically false example. And Stumpf is one of the great historians of the modern time. I mean, you write a whole book in the history of philosophy. Even Bertrand Russell was intellectually honest enough to, although he was an expert historian of philosophy, to admit that there probably wasn't any given philosopher that somebody didn't know more about than he did, except maybe for Leibniz. In other words, he was saying, I'm really an expert on Leibniz, maybe more than anybody else, but if you write a whole history of philosophy, you're bound to make some errors. And curiously, there was a famous debate in 1948 between Bertrand Russell and Father Copleston. And in that debate, Russell made the mistake of taking causality backward through time, which of course clearly is a complete misreading of St. Thomas. And he was accusing Thomas of doing that. Obviously, Father Copleston did not let it go by. The second argument, from the production of things in this world by causes subordinated to one another to a first cause uncaused. This is just moving away from motion and just looking at causality in general, noticing that we're in a world where one thing causes another thing causes another. They get into lovely strings of trying to show what causes what, and sometimes the physics is not too good, but the whole point is that if causality is taking place, any kind of causality at a given time, and you know what it is, if somebody's stabbing you to death, you know that you're receiving a causal influence upon yourself. Not all causality is demonstrated merely by metaphysical speculation. You can have direct experience of it. And all this says is that if the thing that's acting is not the first cause, if it's not the explanation of its own activity and causing, then something else is, and you get back into a regress, which is simultaneous and must lead you to a first cause that has nothing causing it. Otherwise, you'd go to infinity. Since you can't go to infinity, you must come to a first cause uncaused, which is completely outside the order of any secondary causes such as you find in the physical world. The third argument, from corruptible things, which equally might be or not be, they're properly called the possibles, things that could be or not be. And since they could be or not be, the argument, actually it's better given sometimes in the Summa Contra Gentiles, chapter 13 of book 1, because there St. Thomas doesn't go into all this stuff about there being an eternity of possibilities, but he just points out that something that can be or not be doesn't have existence of its very nature. If it had existence of its very nature, it would be necessary that it be. So not everything can be that way, because if that were the case, then nothing would be in existence, because nothing would own existence of its own nature. There's only one other possibility. Something's keeping these things in existence. They're getting existence from something else. And that something else might be called necessary in the sense that it's eternal, but then it's got the problem of, does it own its own existence or not? If it doesn't, eventually you've got to come to a being which exists by its very nature. And that's what we mean by a necessary being. But such a being would be a being in which existence and essence are identical, which means God. And we'll explain that a little bit more in thesis number 23 or 24. The fourth argument starts with things that are more or less, and it says more or less exist or live or understand according to degrees of being, living, and understanding. The argument from relative perfections, where you talk about things being more or less perfect and so forth, really is an argument about things having more or less of existence. It's an argument which is really talking about transcendental being. It's a very often misunderstood argument, but what it really amounts to saying is that things that have more or less of existence obviously don't have existence of their very nature. And therefore the argument actually reverts to the third or the second way, because you got beings composed of essence and existence. one might cause another, but you can't go to infinity that way, so you got to come to a first cause uncaused, a being in which essence and existence are identical, which would be God. So the argument is often not understood very well. The fifth way, as I indicated earlier, is an argument from finality, but it's really an argument from governance. It is a recognition that the entire universe is filled with things that have internal finality, which require intelligence, and an intelligence that explains their very natures. This argument's force cannot be fully understood in terms of contemporary materialism, because you see, when you talk about a thing having internal finality, what are you talking about? You're talking about it having a substantial form. Materialists don't know what you're talking about. To them, you're just a pile of atoms. But to say that you have internal finality means that you have a nature, a principle of being that makes you to be, as an antelope or a worm or a human being, one being of a certain nature with a certain internal finality of all your parts acting for the good of a whole. And that's the intrinsic finality that Aquinas is getting at. That this needs explanation. It certainly isn't explained by the animal itself, but it rather bespeaks a kind of intelligence which is always operative when something acts towards an end. How can an agent act for an end if the end doesn't exist before the agent acts in order to know where it's going? You can't shoot at a target when you don't even know what the target is. And an agent can't act for an end if that end doesn't somehow pre-exist to influence the agent in its activity. But it doesn't exist ontologically because it hasn't reached the target yet. The only other way it could exist is in the intentional order, that is, in the mind. So that's why you have the insight here is that you have a whole universe of things that have an intrinsic finality towards ends, and that intrinsic finality bespeaks intelligence. And the whole universe is just filled with these things, which requires a universal intelligence to explain why all these things are acting towards ends. And remember, don't take any of these arguments all by themselves. They augment one another. They build to a crescendo. You demonstrate in the first way that there's a first mover unmoved, who turns out also to be the first cause uncaused, who also turns out to be the necessary being that is eternal, who also turns out to be the maximum of being, and who also turns out to be intelligent. In other words, you put all of these qualifications together so that the nominal definition that this is the being which we call God, we find fulfills the traditional understanding of the meaning of God. An all-powerful, all-intelligent, ultimate cause and director of everything that we find in the universe. But the whole beauty and the synthesis that's found in the five ways, you see, is utterly unknown to contemporary materialist philosophers. They just don't know what they're missing, literally. And they're there arguing about the behavior of positrons and quarks and looking for a beginning in time. Doesn't matter. Utterly irrelevant to the metaphysician. Interesting, good stuff for arguing on threads of the internet, but not in itself terribly relevant to whether God exists. Because if God exists, he has to always be there, keeping things in existence. Let's do number 24 if we have time. The metaphysical motion of the divine essence is correctly expressed by saying that it is identified with the exercised actuality of its own being. It says one being here, W-O-N, but it's O-W-N. Or that it is subsistent being itself, and that is the reason for its infinite and unlimited perfection. Just to cut to the chase here, what that means is God is pure act. God is pure act. It's got no potentiality. Well, the function of potential, where the essence is distinct from the existence, is to limit the act. So whatever God's got is identical with his very own being and is absolutely unlimited because there's no potential principle to limit it. That's why God is all-powerful, all-knowing, absolutely free, first cause, uncaused, and so forth. That's what that's really getting at. And number 24, by reason of the very purity of his being, God is distinguished from all finite things. What does that mean? It's what I just said. God is pure existence, pure act, only being in which essence is identical to existence. Remember, I'm not trying to demonstrate everything. What we're trying to show here is what is uniquely Thomistic. And this is the key insight of Thomas, that God is subsistent existence itself, pure existence. And by that is absolutely distinguished from all finite things, because all finite things are composite of essence and existence, maybe of form and matter as well. Hence it follows, in the first place, that the world could only have come but from God by way of creation, because the world has nothing unto itself. It takes infinite power to make something from nothing. And to begin with, you've got nothing but God. And God, there is no matter outside him that he's going to take and fashion. It's not the demiurgos of Plato, reaching down and fashioning things according to the forms. There's nothing outside of God. Every act by God is an act of creation when he makes things. It's the only way to do it. Secondly, not even by way of a miracle can any finite nature be given creative power. This isn't something that can be delegated. The power to create, if a creature could create, the power would require infinite power, the creature would be God. So if God could delegate creation, he'd be making more gods, and it can't have more than one God. Remember? Because one would have something the other didn't have, one would be finite. Which of itself directly attains the very being of any being. And finally, no created agent can in any way influence the being of any effect unless it has itself been moved by the first cause. What that means is no finite being can do anything unless God is sustaining him in the motion that he produces. This is actually what I put into the article in Faith and Reason back in 1982 entitled A Variation on the Prima Via of St. Thomas. Because what I was trying to show there is that anytime any change occurs in the world, something new comes into existence. You might say, well, it's just the stuff that was already there. Maybe so, but it's the stuff that was there in a new way. And that new way is a new mode of existence that wasn't there in the universe before, in any way, shape, or manner. Not in this new, unique way that it's expressed. And therefore, that new mode of existence wasn't in the finite world. It has to come directly from God. So that, in fact, God not only creates the universe, according to St. Thomas, not only sustains it in being, that's what we call conservation metaphysically, continued creation. If God quit creating the universe for one moment, zap, it would be gone forever. Not only does he continue it in existence, but for any creature to act in any way, shape, or fashion, God must give it a pre-motion. If it's a physical thing, what we call a physical pre-motion. That is to say, God is still operating as first cause. That's why the proof for God from motion works, because you can take any motion, and from that you can show that you might have prior motions, but you ultimately come to a first mover unmoved, which means that no motion can exist unless God exists. Which conversely is a way of saying that God has to act in order for any motion to occur. And since everything that creatures do is some kind of emotion on their part, what you're really saying is that God must be operative for any creature to do, to act, to do anything at all, to express any perfection. So St. Thomas's conception of the entirety of reality has God at the very pinnacle as not only his own self-existent reason for being, a perfectly pure existence in which essence and existence are identical, but that in creating the world, everything he creates directly from himself. He continues it in existence by an act of created sustenance, and he enables and effects the production of every action of everything that exists so that it can take place, and nothing could take place without his influence. That's what is radically central to St. Thomas's explanation of all that exists. And that's the pinnacle of what these 24 theses come to. So we've completed the 24 theses, unless you have questions. If you don't, what we'll do in the next class, and we may run another class or two out of this, we'll discuss the superiority of St. Thomas's philosophy to any other attempt that's been made, and why. Okay, thank you.
Sound production copyright Oltine Library Services, all rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com